everybody. And you're being recorded. So I'm excited about today, but before I introduce our speaker, I wanted to talk about where we've been and where we're going with the coaching community of practice for this year. And actually, I'm just realizing that I have not yet changed the year up here. So, and it was just, what it is, it's 2019, 2020. So this is our updated plan. You know, we went through a year and a half of our old plan, and you all gave us some ideas through surveys and face-to-face meetings about what you wanted to focus in on. And so, you know, we have some various methods that we consider for each of the topics up on the top. And then last month, we talked about using technology for coaching with Donna Plessel, who is on the line right now, I believe, and she works with the Alabama SPDIG. And she talked about the work she's done and the work with Marcy Rock that she's done, and using technology for coaching and what that's looked like for them. And then today we're going to be talking about coaching at each level of the education system, and some of the questions that you all asked that you were hoping that both our presenter and other members of the community of practice would answer or give some ideas about. How do you determine intensity of coaching services at the different levels? And how have various entities made coaching work at the state and district level? And so Tanya, I'll introduce in a second. And then March, we have tying coaching to fidelity outcomes, and we'll be having a few people from Iowa SPDIG talk about that. And they have this Iowa SPDIG spotlight that shares some of their coaching fidelity data and what that's meant for the intervention fidelity. So if you do this kind of coaching, this amount of time, this is what we're seeing happen. And that's, of course, where we're hoping to move with the coaching. And then in April, we're going to talk about systems coaching, which we've done in the past, but it's not like it's a one and done. Kim St. Martin from the Michigan SPDIG, my Blissy, will be with us for that. And the questions are, how do you grow better systems coaches? What are the basics they need to be trained on? How do you build a strong system that supports system coaches? How do you develop and conduct systems coaching fidelity observations? Now, I'm not going to read all the questions, but I wanted to let you know what's coming up in March and April. And then you can just quickly see the content that we're going to cover in the future months, supporting principals and other administrators so they can support your coaches, monitoring and evaluating coaching, tools for coaches that can be used for any type of content, data coaching, be able to differentiate supports for a wide range of coaches, and communicating the critical value of coaching. So those were what came up for you on the survey and in conversation, some of the questions you asked about it. Now, we can, you can always access this, but after today, I think, John, if you could send it out again, I think that might be a good idea. And people could start filling in the questions they have, and then any other speakers you can think of for these topics would be great. So I'm going to go back and actually just real quickly show what we're talking about today, coach at each level of education system. And then I'm going to let Tanya introduce herself. She's from CSEP, but she can tell you more about her history. She is the newest member of CSEP, which is, are you not the newest member? Do we have a newer one, Tanya?
I am the newest member.
Okay. Sorry, I didn't want to get that. So I'll turn it over to Tanya to tell you a little bit about herself and what she's going to be talking about today. Thank you so much, Tanya.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Jennifer. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen if that's okay.
That would be great.
I think you have to stop. It's saying you need to stop sharing before I can share. So as Jennifer said, my name is Tanya Ilo, and I am the newest member of the CSEP team. I'm really excited to be here. I just joined the CSEP team in the fall, and I just wanted to start by sharing a tiny bit about my experience with coaching so you can see where I'm approaching this work. So many years ago, I served as a district reading and behavior coach, and though I did work with building teams, my main focus of that role was at practice level coaching, so providing direct support to leaders. I spent 5 years coaching teams at a regional level, so working for a regional center, and those were teams who were building tiered models of support. And then most recently, prior to joining CSEP, I was a research associate professor at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln. And I had the opportunity to work with a fantastic team that was working at the state level, developing and providing professional learning, coaching, technical assistance for teams and coaches at the regional, district, building levels around development of an MTSS framework and implementation of evidence-based practices within that framework. And then at my time at UNL, I also was co-principal investigator for a randomized controlled trial across 9 states that looked at professional learning and distance coaching to support teachers as they use data for decision making, and also supported interventionists through bug in the ear. So while they're actually providing interventions, providing coaching for them in the use of effective instructional practices. So I tell you all of that to say that I've learned so much from the teams and teachers and administrators and coaches that I've been fortunate to work with over the years. So what I'm going to share with you today draws heavily from those learnings and experiences in working with others and through that research. So if, again, I think that's enough about me. I'll go ahead and get started talking today about considerations for determining intensity of coaching supports across across the cascade. So both at a systems level all the way down to practice level coaching. So my understanding is that all of you who are part of this today have a really big job of either providing coaching support yourselves or supporting coaches who are providing support. So there are probably a wide range of content and skills that you're working with providing that support on. So I mentioned learning from a lot of educators I've worked with. I also anticipate all of us learning from each other today. So I have a few dedicated times where we'll stop and have an opportunity for people to discuss. I don't know, you may typically do that through the chat box, or if it seems like we have a small group of people want to just answer out to the group, that'd be great too. But just jump in at any time and share your experiences. I definitely think we can all learn from each other. And also any questions that come up, feel free to interrupt me anytime for those. So in our really brief time, here are the things that I want to try to hit on is one, what are some of those dimensions of coaching intensity? So what are different ways that we can intensify coaching supports? What kind of things do we need to consider to help us determine what that intensity should be? And then going through some examples, again, across the cascade of tools that people have used that may be helpful to you as you're thinking about assisting coaches as they support others. So let's go ahead and start with thinking about the purpose of coaching. So what are the goals of coaching at all levels of the system, and even what are the levels that we're talking about? So when I'm thinking of the levels, I'm thinking of potentially state to regional teams to district teams, district to building, building to teacher. And that could involve coaching teams, coaching coaches, coaching teachers, paraeducators, other implementers. So we've got a lot of folks who are involved and a lot of different potential levels involved. So with that in mind, I want you to just, take a minute and say, what are the goals of coaching? So why are we providing coaching support? And again, I don't know if you typically have folks do this in the chat or call out. I'm fine with either. I've opened the chat box in case people want to jot some things down there. But what are the goals of coaching?
And Tanya, I'll go ahead and jump in, not to answer your question, but let people on the line know that I muted several people that may not have been muted because we were hearing some background noise. So please feel free to unmute now and respond to the question, what are the goals of coaching at all levels of the education system? Or of course, as Tanya said, the chat box works also.
Great, thanks, John.
Hey, this is Carol Moffett from North Carolina. One of the things that we talk about is that we're wanting to impact student performance. And so that's our, our main goal of the coaching the coaches and coaching the teachers is to get down to the student level and impact students and their progress.
Great. So an ultimate goal is impacting students, student progress. I see someone in the chat box, Jennifer, put for districts to implement a multi-tiered systems of support framework. So coaching with that goal in mind. Any other ideas? I see job embedded professional learning for teachers. Great. So these are great goals of coaching. When we think about coaching to get results for students, when we think about coaching to get districts implementing, that's really our goals. So our goals are to build people's skills and fluency to be able to implement, and also to cultivate a reflectiveness, to get people to be reflecting on what they're doing to continuously improve over time. And I think that it's really important to think about those two distinctions because in a lot of coaching, and if you look at some of the coaching models that are out there, they're much more focused on the reflectiveness. So coaching becomes all about conversation. And sometimes we really need to be coaching with the goal of improving implementation. So improving building skills, applying knowledge, getting to a fluency with skills. So thinking about those two sort of purposes of coaching. We also have facilitators of systems change. So coaching people to help them become facilitators of systems change. So I want us to be thinking about coaching for skills, application of knowledge, implementation, and then also coaching for people to continuously improve and reflect as we go through today. So there are a few assumptions that we need to have before we ever start talking about the intensity of coaching. We have to first make sure that we have a really good coaching system in place. So I won't be talking a lot about this, but I can't really talk about intensity unless I say we have to start with a good base of a great coaching system. So there should be the clear purpose for coaching, a coaching process, expectations for coaching understood by everyone, a process for evaluating coaching, coaching model, use of coaching cycles. Whatever you're expecting people to be coached around, there should be high quality initial professional learning around that, whether that's content to build knowledge, again, to build skills. So there should be good high quality initial PD. And the coaching really should be about improving or building, cultivating competency with whatever the thing is that we want people to be implementing. So coaching needs to have a variety of strategies. Frequency of coaching should vary based on need. And then there need to be data collected to help us determine the effectiveness of that coaching and using those data to continuously improve the coaching process. So do we have goals for coaching? Are we looking at whether or not coaching is working? Collecting data on what we would expect to see as a result of coaching. So those are just, as you all are all familiar, those are just pieces of a good coaching system that you want to have in place before you start thinking about how do we intensify coaching. Because sometimes when I get asked how do we determine the intensity of coaching, or how much longer do I coach this team or this person, it's often because there's some sort of underlying issue. Something isn't working and people aren't sure what the next steps are. But it could be that they haven't clearly defined what coaching is, or not everyone's on the same page with the goals of coaching. So it's important to have that up front as part of your coaching plan prior to thinking about intensifying. So once we have a really good coaching system in place, coaching plan, then we can start to think about how do we intensify and what are some of those dimensions on which we can intensify coaching. So I want you to think about this. What are some of those dimensions? And we're going to talk about some of those in just a second, but I want you to think about what are some possible dimensions on which you can intensify coaching. And again, you can put these in the chat or feel free to call them out as well.
This is Carol again. One of the things that pops in my mind to start with is just, you know, the amount of time that we spend with that coach based on the goals, and where the teacher or the coach or whoever we're coaching is at, where we start, knowing where we want to get to, and then determining, you know, how they're doing with that new piece or that new learning, and then, you know, are they making progress quickly? If they're not, they'll need additional coaching sessions, longer amounts of time, more frequently. Then if it's going really well and they're meeting those coaching goals that we had set together, then we could meet less often, have that coaching session less often, and maybe shorter amounts of times. That's the first thing that pops in my mind.
Great, that's a great one. So Carol mentioned just time is one dimension that we could vary our coaching intensity. So depending on how long it's taking someone to meet their goal or how far they are from their goal, you might need more time or less time, and that can come in the amount of time or the frequency of coaching. Great. I'm seeing in the chat frequency, also the level of modeling that's provided for people is a way to intensify coaching. Providing multiple arenas for coaches, so face-to-face, virtual, formal skills-based training, the number of people being coached at one time. These are all great dimensions of coaching. And I'm gonna share some of mine and see that you all have already hit on quite a few of these. So this is not an exhaustive list of dimensions, but these are some of the ways that we can think about varying intensity of coaching support. So both in the chat and Carol mentioned the dosage. So you may have to meet with some teams or some teachers more frequently than others, with some coaches more frequently than others, depending on how far they are from reaching their goals, how much assistance they might need in utilizing a skill or applying that knowledge. Jennifer mentioned the number of people being coached at one time, so that goes into the next one of group versus individual coaching. This can also be a great way to look at saving some resources. So oftentimes coaching time is very valuable time, and so if there are individuals who have a common goal or a need, maybe they need some, they could all benefit from practice in a particular skill, bringing those folks together to do that with some group coaching as opposed to working with each person individually can be a great way to vary the intensity. You can also do that at a team level. In particular, if you bring together teams to create a network of support, so that can decrease the intensity of support that's needed from the coach if you've got teams that can coach each other. If they're in similar places, or if you've got some advanced teams who would be willing to sort of coach or work with some teams that are just getting started. So creating some networked teams is another example there. Carol mentioned the coaching goal. So sometimes we have to actually adjust the goal that we're working toward. That can be another way of intensifying. A lot of times, in particular, if we're talking about teachers or paraeducators or other educators implementing a program or a practice, we sometimes don't realize the number of different skills that go into that, and we set goals that are too broad. We expect people to do way too many things at one time. So we might have to look at components of implementing a program or practice. And I'll give some examples of this when I go to the examples. Kind of break those down, narrow that focus so that we're working on prerequisite skills or easier skills and building up to those, to that broader goal incrementally. So actually adjusting our goal. Also recognizing that it can sometimes be easier to or easier or more difficult, whether we're applying knowledge or whether we're actually using a skill. So I think of, for a team, perhaps that's learning how to develop a process. So let's say a team is learning how to develop a process for selecting evidence-based practices. It may not take as much coaching for them to utilize some knowledge around how to do that as it would take if a teacher is learning a brand new skill and maybe they need more support in applying that skill. So thinking about, what are we expecting people to do? Are we expecting them to apply some knowledge or to use a skill, and recognizing that our intensity of coaching may differ there. And I think it was Jennifer who said earlier the level of modeling might change. So that kind of goes into these next two, which is the immediacy of our coaching is another way that we can vary intensification. So I often see a lot of coaching that happens outside of the setting. So the teachers are in classrooms teaching, but the coaching is happening in meetings outside of the classroom. And that's less intensive than coaching that's happening in the moment in the classroom while the teacher is teaching. And for some people who are trying to build skills or build fluency with skills, that in the moment coaching with that more immediacy can be much more powerful for them than coaching that's happening outside of the classroom, even if there's practice involved in that coaching outside of the classroom. The same with team meetings. So the immediacy of when the coaching is occurring is another way that we can vary intensity. And then finally, the coaching strategy. So making sure that we're matching the coaching strategy to what the need is. If it's a need to build skill, then coaching strategies related to practicing, getting feedback on that can be really beneficial. If you think about it, if someone, there's a lot of videotape used in coaching, but if I really need skill practice, watching myself on video may not help me at all. I may need someone to show me, someone to provide feedback right while I'm doing the thing that I'm trying to build the skill in. So we really have to match the coaching strategy to what it is that the person is doing. And if someone's having an issue with implementation, matching the coaching strategy to why they may be having an issue with implementation. And again, I'll give some concrete examples of this in just a minute. And then also being very intentional about gradually releasing responsibility, in particular when we're coaching teams. So these are all, you all came up with a lot of these dimensions. These are all ways that we can think about varying our coaching intensity when we're working with teams or with teachers. So when you think about varying the intensity, it's really important with all of this that we're using some data to guide our decision-making around the level of intensity of coaching. So I want you to think about, what are some data sources that coaches that you're working with are already collecting, or that you think they could collect or use to guide decision-making around those dimensions of intensity. So I'm seeing observations, definitely having observations at multiple levels. So having observations of coaches themselves, observations of the teams or the educators that the coaches are working with, having coaching logs. So the coaches documenting what they're doing within coaching can be really important data to help with determining level of intensity. Annette said that they have an MTSS implementation rubric that was designed to guide coaching. So using that to help identify level of intensity using student data, coaching self-assessments. These are all great examples. A coaching service delivery plan that's based on a site plan from Professional Learning. These are all great data sources that you already have coaches using that they can use to help determine the intensity of coaching supports. So here are just, again, you've already come up with data sources. You've got a lot of the data sources that I have listed here, but here are some potential things that you might want to share, with your coaches to think about in terms of how do I determine level of intensity. So thinking about how new is this skill or this content to the person or the team I'm coaching, the newer it is. Sometimes the more support someone might need with it, not always, but sometimes. If they're expected to use the knowledge or the skill, we have here observation. So actually observing to see how well are they doing with using that. Having teams or teachers self-report on use of that. That's other potential data sources on applying knowledge and skill. If there's an implementation issue, gathering data that can help you determine why there's an implementation issue. So why is someone not implementing as you would expect? What's kind of getting in the way of that? That can be, again, observation data, can be interview data, or just, asking people why they think they may be having some issues with implementation, what support they might need. Someone mentioned coaching logs, so documentation of coaching supports here, and then someone also mentioned student data. So you all hit on a lot of those potential data sources that can help with determining intensity. So a couple more considerations before I make this a little more concrete with some examples. So none of this that I'm going to talk about next is an exact science, but I want to share with you this idea of matching the intensity or the coaching strategy to the type of issue that may be occurring, or to the type of to what you're expecting the person to do. So using data to guide this. So what you see here is just an example of some of the potential coaching strategies for varying intensity levels. So on these tables, the one on the left is coaching strategies at the individual level, and the one on the right is more for teams. And you'll see various coaching strategies and then just some descriptions. And these will be very familiar to you. I'm sure that you use a lot of these coaching strategies, or your coaches are using these coaching strategies. But one of the things that I've found in working with coaches is that they often overuse the same strategy. So we'll see coaches that kind of get into a comfort of using one strategy for everyone, or one strategy for every issue, one strategy all the time. And one of the ones I see the most is actually the first one, observation and feedback. And this happens both in teams and with working with individuals, just observing what's going on and providing some feedback afterwards. And although that can be a helpful strategy for a lot of people, it's really most helpful when someone already has a skill and they just need to tweak something, or you have some ideas for how to make it even better. And the other thing I've found is that over-reliance on observation and feedback can actually create what people like to call resistance with teachers or with teams. I don't really think it's resistance. I think we just haven't usually found like a coaching strategy that works best for those folks. But if you think about it, just continuously coming, watching what I'm doing, and then just giving me feedback on it without really participating with me can definitely lead to resistance, or make me feel like we're not really partners in this coaching. So I say that because I want to encourage you to have your coaches really vary the strategies that they use, but do it in a data-based way, because this is one of the key ways that I think we can come up with varying intensity that I don't always see. So this next slide here shares a little bit of how do we match the intensity of coaching to those strategies. So for someone who's newly received training or retraining in something, some of the best strategies are co-planning and preparation, side-by-side coaching, demonstration, and shadow or mirror coaching. And that's really the most intensive level of individual coaching. And that's, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, that's where you're chunking whatever the thing is that people are being coached in into really small chunks. And the coach does it first, and then the person being coached does exactly the same thing after the coach. And then the coach does it, person does exactly the same thing. So you can see that's the most intensive level, but can be really beneficial for people who are new to a skill, or if people really need support with building a skill. I mentioned earlier videotaping. I see a lot of videotaping within coaching. And one of the areas that videotaping can be really helpful is if the reason why someone is having an issue with implementation is that they're not aware of what they're doing, that's when videotaping can be helpful. But again, if someone is trying to build a skill, videotaping watching themselves is not necessarily the best match in terms of the intensity of the strategy to the need for the coaching support. So I won't go through all of these because I'll definitely share these slides with Jennifer to post. But I really want you to encourage your coaches to vary their intensity of coaching support, because this is probably, in terms of intensity, one that I see the least is using a variety of strategies. Any questions or comments before I keep going? Webinars are tough for me because I can't read how people are doing, if they're with me or if they're having questions or want to share comments. So
Yeah, it's a great idea to stop and just ask for questions or thoughts, because I know some of this is going to be new, and I think that's great. I love it that you're bringing new content. But as we're thinking about how you're going to apply this back to your coaching system, what do you need to know more about?
mm-hmm.
All right, well, I'm not hearing any from my side. I don't see anything in the chat.
Okay.
This is Shatarupa. Can you hear me?
Yes.
You sound great.
Okay, great. Sorry, I'm having internet issues, so I'm cutting in and out, so I'm missing a large chunk of this. But I really like the slide that I'm currently looking at, and looking at the different strategies of coaching and when to use them, or what to consider. I think that's going to be very, very helpful. So thank you, Tanya.
Oh, great. Thanks. Yeah, and like I said, I'll definitely share these with Jennifer to get to you all. But this is one area where, in working with coaches, we really have seen a difference is when people start to use something like this to vary their coaching strategy, but not just vary the strategy, vary it with purpose. So based on some sort of data, I know that this person could benefit from some preparation and planning ahead of a lesson, or preparation and planning before a team meeting to help them facilitate a team meeting. So this is one of the areas where we've seen the biggest difference in terms of looking at intensity. And again, I'm going to get into more concrete examples right after this. So one note about dosage, so duration and frequency of coaching, is that people often will also ask, well, how long should I coach someone, or how long should we coach a team? And if you have the resources, if that person hasn't met the goals, or if that team hasn't met the goals, but they're making some sort of forward progress, continue coaching. You may have different goals, or you may change the strategies or the focus over time, but you could continue coaching until they meet all of those goals. If they're not making progress toward the goals, though, sometimes just increasing the duration or the frequency of coaching doesn't make a difference. That's where we really have to often revisit other areas of intensification. So is the strategy I'm using every time I meet with them not working? And it's not going to do any good for me to just continue meeting with them unless I'm changing what I'm doing when I'm meeting with them. So if the current coaching strategy isn't a match, if it's not working, then just adjusting the dosage won't usually impact that. So just thinking about that in terms of dosage. So interrupt me at any time, but I didn't hear a lot of questions or comments, and I want to have time for examples, so I'm going to get right into some of those examples. So this first example is a state team that was providing support at a regional level, so supporting regional folks who are working with districts and buildings. And this was around building and refining their multi-tiered systems of support framework. So the goals of this coaching were twofold. One was to build capacity of the regional teams to support the professional learning and coaching, and then also to build capacity of the district and building teams that were participating in this at the same time. So we collected some data. I'm sure that these supports look very familiar to you. I'm sure these are the types of supports that you're providing in your states and your coaches are providing. So there was professional learning, coaching between professional learning sessions, and then ongoing evaluation. And what we found during that ongoing evaluation was that observation data were showing us that the coaches were not systematic in the supports that they were providing. So from one state coach to another, working with regional teams and district teams, it could look very different. And I'm not talking about just because the context of those regions or districts were different. They could be working on the same, trying to build the same skill, but their coaching supports were very different. What we found was that often the coaches had meetings that didn't necessarily have a clear purpose or focus. So they might show up at a team meeting and they're just part of the team meeting with that team. So that was one of the pieces of data. We also saw that the coaches were doing the majority of the talking sometimes instead of the regional team or the district teams. So that to us was suggesting that instead of having a system where we're building capacity by coaches bringing expertise, coaches were being seen as experts, and they were falling into that role where they were doing all the talking, kind of telling people what to do as opposed to really building capacity. The team ratings on their MTSS implementation rubrics were kind of all over the place. They weren't necessarily showing that they were making steady progress in a lot of the areas that the coaching was intended to support. The team ratings of their coaches were very different from coach to coach. And finally, a fairly large number of the schools that were being coached were not making progress in their student results. So we had to take a look at what is going on with this coaching system and what can we potentially do to try to impact some of these data that we were seeing. So this is just an example of, you can see the MTSS implementation rubric example, the staff survey results. These were some of those pieces of data that we took a look at. So all of that I just mentioned made it appear that some teams needed just a lot more support than other teams. Like, that's how we originally looked at it, is, gosh, this team hasn't made as much progress. We really need to focus on giving them more and more and more. But then we realized, wait a minute, maybe we should examine the effectiveness of our actual coaching supports. It may not be about the team at all. It may be about what we've provided for the team, which it was. And we discovered there was a lack of a clear process for coaching, a lack of clear coaching goals when coaching at the systems level, coaching to teams. So what we decided to do for this was that the state team already had an existing scope and sequence of professional learning, but what hadn't been further delineated was the coaching to support the professional learning. So what we decided to do was to take the training and chunk it out and figure out what are all the potential coaching activities that may need to occur between sessions to help teams apply the content they just learned in that session. And we created lines for coaching and technical assistance within the broader scope and sequence. And then from that, created some outlines for what coaching around that particular thing could look like. So for example, this one is coaching outline on how to help people collect observation data. And so we recognize that all teams are different and the coaching still isn't going to look exactly the same because it shouldn't look exactly the same in each setting. But these guidelines or these outlines provided a little bit more consistency and served a couple of purposes. So each of the coaching activities had an outline like this, and each outline included, here are some things to think about before the coaching, during the coaching visit, after the coaching visit. It included potential agendas that could be then adapted, and then any resources that are needed for that session. And they were just, all in a folder with this information. So these were developed over time based on learnings. They were continuously revised as we learned more, as people used them. And it really helped serve a couple of purposes. So some of the benefits that we saw from this were that it did help in determining the level of intensity, because now we had more of an idea of what are all of those potential things that teams might need to implement the content for the training. So we could say, oh, well, this team's already got that. They don't need support. So we were still showing up to provide coaching support around something that the team already had, they didn't need. So that helped with some of that. It also built in intentionality in gradual release of responsibility. So I mentioned that we were having issues where coaches were doing all of the talking. Coaches were really just basically telling the teams, here's your next step, here's your next step, here's your next step. Not focused on building capacity. So these outlines were intentionally designed with, here's the goal of this type of meeting. If we're trying to build a skill, here's how we build it. You're, as the coach, going to walk them through the first one. Then you're going to have them do the next one. Then you're going to, do that gradual release. And within that, again, teams are different, and you might have to do several examples with a team before they're ready to do it on their own. Another team, only one. But this at least provided intentionality and built-in gradual release. It provided some data on fidelity of systems level coaching that we hadn't had previously, which really helped with continuous improvement and consistency across those providers. It also was a useful tool in not recreating the wheel. So we had all these coaches providing coaching support in the same things, and they were all creating their own thing. But this gave people something to start with. And then at the regional level, this was then very easy to share with the folks at the regional level, as they were going to be the ones providing the support. So the way that rolled out is that in the regional settings, the state coaches partnered with the regional teams very intensively at first, but again with intentionality towards gradual release. So there was coaching around content prior to that being delivered for district and building teams, co-creation of activities or co-adaptation of activities, because the regional people knew more about the context they were working in, opportunities for co-delivery. And then coaching was provided by the state coaches initially with the idea of gradual release built in for those regional coaches. And then as additional cohorts or additional sites were added after initial sites, the regional team took over, still with support from the state team. So they weren't just thrown out there, because there were some regional teams that needed more intensive support, so they needed more co-delivery of content before they were ready to do it on their own, more co-coaching before they were ready to do it on their own. But those tools that were developed based on what we learned from that coaching were helpful in that process. So any questions just about some of those ideas at the state to regional level before I move into building practice level coaching?
Tanya, while we're waiting for questions, I just want to say that's such a nice way to see things laid out, to find out what the challenge was and then how you approached it. And I think those are really useful materials that you shared. Would you be able to share that with us? Is it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. I didn't know if it was too specific to that state you were working with.
Yeah, I don't think it's probably too specific. I mean, I'll double check, but I would think that they would be fine with me sharing that. Sharing at least a few, maybe not all of it, but at least a couple of examples, if that would be helpful for people, for sure.
Okay, great, thank you.
Okay, well, if there aren't any questions, I'll just keep going because I am looking at the time and I want to be sure we have time to make it through the other examples. So this is an example of varying intensity at the building practice level. So this was a district that was working on providing professional learning in explicit instruction. They provided professional learning in a variety of explicit instruction techniques, but their initial goal was in increasing active student responding. So what they discovered right off the bat is this is going to be varying the goal and narrowing the goal a little bit. So they provided training and explicit instruction and then just sent teachers out to classrooms to do this. And I have seen this time and time again. Anita Archer, who is a very dynamic presenter, has been to Nebraska many, many times. And most teachers have seen her, but I don't always see instruction that looks like her when I go in classrooms. And so this was happening in this district, and we had a few hypotheses that we worked through that people weren't always expected to use what they had learned in professional learning in the classroom. There were too many strategies that were thrown at them at one time, and they couldn't discern what to do first, what was going to be most important to start with. They didn't have the coaching and the follow-up support and the time to utilize those strategies or to know how to use it in their actual materials. So with those hypotheses, this team decided that they would start with actually identifying, here's how we will know we're actually implementing these explicit instruction strategies. So they said, let's lay out all the strategies we expect people to use, and let's say by when we expect what percentage of teachers to be able to utilize those strategies. So this is an example of their goals and the types of strategies that they wanted teachers to use. I mentioned that initially they were expecting people to use all of them. So they had a fidelity checklist that had all of these on it. And as you can probably imagine, they were not seeing people right off the bat using all of these strategies. So that led to, this is that full fidelity check. That led to saying, well, what if we focus on one? So within our expectations here, let's focus just on getting engagement. Let's get more students responding chorally through partner responding, that type of thing. So then we worked with them to create some targeted checks. So instead of doing that full fidelity checklist, let's just create a targeted check that says, here are the 3 key pieces to an effective error correction, or here are the 3 key pieces to effective choral responding. And let's just start there. Let's get 80% of our teachers to these 3 key pieces consistently. So they started collecting data, and they began to identify, are there certain areas in which all of our teachers might need support? And this goes back to Jennifer's comment earlier of sometimes our coaching should happen in groups instead of individuals. So when they saw an area that the majority of teachers could use some additional support, that's when they used group coaching. So they said if more than 30% of our teachers need support in this, we're going to do group coaching, not necessarily individual coaching. And then once we reach our standard of 80% of our teachers, 70% of our teachers implementing that, then we'll move on to the next strategy. we'll continue to provide individual support for those who aren't there yet, but we're going to move on to the next strategy. So they became very data-based in how they provided coaching. So after using these data, they went through what we call data-based coaching, where they use systematic coaching cycles, differentiated coaching support, a variety of strategies to provide that support. And this is kind of what that process looks like: identifying the focus, collecting data on it, providing coaching support, and then collecting follow-up data on that to help figure out at what intensity people need support. So using those targeted checks to say, you know, are we making a difference or not? Is our coaching impacting practice or not? And if it's not, then looking at varying the intensity for those who were receiving the support. This is what I mentioned about the group versus individual coaching. And then again, they use these targeted checks to say, have we met the goal or not? So the targeted checks became almost like progress monitoring for their coaching. So if I'm providing this coaching support, I should expect over time for this teacher to see improvements in these targeted observations that were being collected. So that's an example of how data were used to determine coaching versus individual, and then what type of individual strategies are used at a building level. Two more really quick examples as I look at the time. This was an example of providing support for district coaches. So this, someone mentioned earlier coaching logs. I apologize, I've already lost that name in the chat, but someone mentioned that coaching logs can be really helpful in guiding intensification decisions, and that is definitely true. So this is an example of coaching, well, this is an example of some of the observation data that were collected within that process. And based on these data, coaches were providing support. So this is what their coaching logs looked like. So here they're logging what the focus of the coaching support is, the coaching strategy that was being used, and then whether or not that was making an impact. And what you'll notice if you look at this closely is that there's a lot of observation and feedback here, a lot of observation and feedback. But they were still saying needs additional coaching, continual coaching is needed, needs additional coaching. So they were just doing the same coaching strategy over and over again and still needing coaching for these teachers. So this brought to our attention, I was working with the folks at the district level, that, you know, maybe this isn't an issue with teachers implementing that. Maybe it's an issue with needing to coach the coaches around the coaching strategies that they're using and how to match those coaching strategies to the needs that the teachers had. So this then led to, it informed it at multiple levels here, that the coaches were really over-reliant on observation and feedback, because this wasn't just one coach, it was multiple coaches. And that over-reliance on one particular strategy, we started to wonder, why was that happening with the coaches? So either the coaches aren't confident in other strategies, or they're not confident in how to match a different strategy to why an implementation issue might be happening, or the type of coaching that might best support that teacher. So this led to additional work that needed to happen for the district coaches. So there was a district person responsible for supervising, working with the coaches, and she began to work with them on how to match the coaching strategy to the implementation issue. This included doing observations alongside the coaches. It included sitting down, looking at all of those data together, coming up with what kind of coaching strategies they might need. And then that person actually doing some modeling of coaching, because it wasn't just the match. Some people were not as confident with doing side-by-side coaching as they were with just going in, doing an observation, providing some feedback. So the coach would actually provide coaching, then so the district level person would provide coaching. I did some of this as well, sat side-by-side coaches, providing some support as they were coaching, some ideas as they were coaching. So this is an example. I'm so glad someone brought up coaching log earlier, of exactly how coaching log data led to this isn't really about the implementers. This is about our coaches needing more intensity in the support that they're receiving. So then the last example that I'll share is support for building level teams. So here what we have, is a building level team, and I'll just back up a little bit. I'm not sure what happens here, but this was a district had set some expectations similar to those instructional expectations earlier. The district had expectations of every building related to their delivery and implementation of interventions. So these are all indicators that they had established for whether or not their intervention system was working well at the building level. So they used these data to identify that they found that none of the 5 buildings in this district were meeting the criteria in terms of delivering interventions daily as they were intended. So they used these data to then go back and do some problem solving with the building teams to help them figure out why this was occurring and what they needed to do to support those building teams. Because the building teams had been reporting to them that they were faithfully meeting every week, doing these things, but it wasn't actually showing up then when they were looking at some of the data that they were receiving. So in this process, they also discovered that there were some issues that were happening across their buildings with lesson progress. So lesson progress was a huge issue in their intervention delivery, and it had been occurring quite frequently. There was a particular team meeting at which the teams were supposed to be talking about lesson progress. And the teams were faithfully having these meetings. They were looking at their observation data. They knew that lesson progress was an issue, but they were never getting to the planning and the problem solving that was supposed to happen within those team meetings. So they realized, wait a minute, we've been just making sure people are having those meetings, but we haven't been seeing if the teams need help in what they're doing with those meetings. So they were meeting, they were doing the easy things to do, the compliance things, checking off things. But when it came to actually problem solving, they didn't know how to problem solve around that. So it required a coach coming in, again, going through gradual release of showing them how do we problem solve when there's an issue with lesson progress. What do we need to do about it? And then working with them through it. So setting up that intentional gradual release. So I apologize, I'm looking at the time. I will have to skip this discussion, but just kind of in wrapping up here. My hope for today is that you have been validated in a lot of the things you're doing related to coaching, that maybe you've seen a new tool that you want to take a look at that might help with coaching. But here are some of the key things that I would say I've learned from coaches, and you've probably seen this too, that we have to be using the data to help us identify and determine the level of intensity. There's got to be a clear overall plan, a coaching system in place. Coaches really need resources and tools, and we have to look at how we're coaching coaches. So I apologize for having to rush through those activities here at the end, but I do want to be respectful of people's time. So I'll quickly just remind you that through SysUp and NERN, there is the Active Implementation Hub. There are several modules on the hub related to coaching that I would highly recommend. You could take a look through. If you go to where it says modules and lessons, if you just type in AI Hub in Google, you go to modules and lessons, you'll see those coaching modules on there. And then just wanted to remind you, here is the SysUp team. You can contact any of us with questions that you may have. But I'm happy to stay a little bit longer if there are people, if we can leave the Zoom line open and there are people that want to share comments or questions. But I think we're right at time.
Thank you so much, Tanya. I feel comfortable because I know this group pretty well that they heard a lot of new information today that they can make use of in their coaching delivery system. So this was perfectly what we needed for this topic. I really appreciate you taking the time to put together something so comprehensive and detailed that people can apply it in their day-to-day coaching systems work. Any questions for Tanya? And then John says he's happy to keep the Zoom open. I personally am going to have to get off, but that doesn't, John has the line, so he can take care of it.
Okay.
So we're getting a lot of thank you. I see my coaches at the end of the month. I look forward to sharing with them. This was an excellent presentation. Thank you. Yep, I think people probably feel the same way I do, that this is stuff that we'll be able to think about and use for quite a bit of time into the future. So thank you, Tanya, and I'll leave you with John and the Zoom line for everyone. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Jennifer, and thanks for inviting me to talk with the group today. So like I said, I'll stick around. I know I definitely want to be respectful of people's time, so feel free to hop off if you want to, but I'll stay a few more, a little bit longer, just see if people do have any questions or comments.